Hey guys, this is Matthew, and I wanted to do a quick kind of introduction to the Adobe Photoshop interface. So basically, just kind of, when you're getting started with Photoshop, you want to have a good handle on the interface essentially and how to navigate different things. And so I have just opened up Photoshop so you can find the icon usually down here in your menu bar on a Mac, on the bottom here. So here's Adobe Photoshop in my circumstance. If you're having trouble finding it, you can always come over here to the launch pad, launch the Adobe applications. Like you can see the icons are kind of peppered within the launch pad in different locations. So here is my Photoshop and then Illustrator and InDesign and the other guys. That being said, I've already got Photoshop open, so I think I'm set to go, but I also want to make it a little bit bigger so that I can see it more clearly on the screen. So I'm using a Mac, by the way, and I'm going to click this little green sort of button over here, and it'll kind of move things up to a larger scale so that we can see things more appropriately, okay? This is what you'll see when you open Photoshop. It's pretty standard. It doesn't automatically open a file unless you right click a particular file and say open with Photoshop, but you can just open up the application and then essentially you have to decide what's going to happen next. Um, the nice thing about Photoshop is it will show recently opened files. So these are some, like this is something that I scanned this morning. And these are some photographs that students have submitted to me that I was reviewing, more kind of scanned items that I was bringing into Photoshop. So these are all just kind of previous things that I was opening up with Photoshop, okay? If I want to make a brand new file, I can just click on the new file icon, okay? Uh, Additionally, I can open up an old file, okay? And so if I don't see it here, as far as the icons or the previews of the other files, I can come over here and I can click open, all right? And in that circumstance, it's thinking right now, you can see the browser window will pop up and I can navigate to the file within my project folder that I have set up within my course folder and I can get going in that regard. Okay. So I'm going to cancel out of this though, because I actually want to just start a brand new, fresh file in Photoshop. Okay. So I'm going to click new file. As soon as I click new file, this new document dialog box is going to pop up, and there are a few different things to notice here. First of all, I think it's always important to give your project a name. And so in my classes, everything is project based. So what I would advise you to do, for example, if we're working on project 4, you call your project dash 4 and maybe dash and some sort of a description of the project. Like maybe it's a typography project or maybe it's a postcard or something like that. But give it something descriptive, which can be helpful later if you happen to be searching for that file on your computer. So if you give it a name right now that is relatively descriptive, it can be helpful down the road. I also want to point out that when I am naming things, I always try to put a dash in between, like project dash for dash typography, or maybe, and then additional dash, I don't know, poster, something of that nature. Okay. So that makes it a little bit easier for maybe for me to find it down the road if it sort of gets lost on my hard drive. Hopefully that doesn't happen though, because you're being organized with a course folder, and within that course folder are subfolders that are essentially for each of your projects that you're working on in a class with me. That being said, okay, let's take a step back and let's see here. Saved. Sometimes these are essentially presets, okay? So recent is really handy. So custom, 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 yada, yada, yada. So maybe you're working on photographs. Maybe you're working in print. Maybe you're working on a graphic for a website. And you'll notice that the parameters kind of change a little bit over here. And we'll kind of talk about that here in a second. All right. But it's very important that first of all, yes, you name your file appropriately, and then you think about the context or like, what kind of file is this and what is it going to be used for? So for example, if you're making a print Photoshop file, you're probably going to want the units or increments to be in inches, okay? And maybe you're going to even print it on a sheet of paper that is 8.5 by 11. So you want to make sure that your artboard is 8.5 wide and 11 inches tall, okay? Or conversely, maybe instead of the portrait orientation, you want it to be the landscape orientation. So you can just click this icon right there and it will swap those numbers, which is pretty cool, okay? So in when you're printing something on an Epson printer, or it's a print document, quote unquote, you want it to be 300 DPI. 300 is the minimum quality for a professional file in the field, okay? So just kind of keep that in mind. 300 is the magic number for a print document. And notice how it's saying 300 pixels per square inch. And we're using inches increments, okay? So 300 pixels per square inch. Color mode, I'm going to say I want this to be CMYK, and I'll tell you why. Because CMYK, if you go to Best Buy or if you go to Amazon and you're shopping for ink for your Epson printer, it's going to come in CMYK or cyan, magenta, yellow, and K is for black color, okay? So those are that's the color ink that you're going to be buying for your Epson printer. So we want the document that we're making for that context to be the same. We want it to be CMYK. We'll talk about RGB here in a second. We can also bump up the quality to 16-bit, but I think 8-bit actually works just fine for now. And as far as the background, a white background is appropriate for this circumstance. So that's like the print preset. But let's say that we're going to do something for web, okay? Notice how everything is kind of changed over here. We're no longer talking inches as far as increments. Now it's moved over to pixels, okay? So if you're looking at your iPhone or an Android device or a desktop computer screen or a laptop computer screen, that is basically measuring that space in pixels, not necessarily inches, okay? And so we have it's saying 1366 pixels by 768, and of course we can change that dependent on the document that we're making. I'll give you an example of some documents that I've made in the past when I was a web developer. I used to make things like web banners, okay? Sometimes you need a logo in the top left-hand corner, and it needs to be like maybe 150 by 150 pixels so it can fit into the website structure. And so, understanding like just essentially like how pixels operate, as far as dimensions is really important. But there's also a very specific difference between the print world and the web or online or digital graphic world, okay? So, and sometimes you want something to be able to be sent, conveniently online, and you don't want it to be 300 PPI because that turns into a document that is like, 20 or 25 megabytes, which is just way too big. So sometimes you just want to squinch something down to a web format anyway. And we'll talk about that, in tutorials down the road. But it's very important to understand the difference between inches and pixels when you're creating a Photoshop document. Um, by the way, a desktop screen is always 72 PPI or dots per square inch. And remember, I was just saying that if you're going to print something in an Epson printer, it's 300 PPI or DPI or dots per square inch. But if you're preparing a document to put on a screen, it's going to be 72 PPI or DPI or dots per square inch. And that's standard and it doesn't change. It will always be 72 DPI. Since I've been working with these programs, it's always been 72 PPI, and I don't anticipate that it will change. Now, notice how the color mode has reverted to RGB, so red, green, and blue. That's because the color space on a screen is always RGB. It is not CMYK. CMYK is if you're printing something, but we're not printing anything. We're just going to put it on the screen. Believe it or not, this color mode thing is sort of important because CMYK will render color slightly differently compared to RGB, and we want our colors to be accurate. That is why this is a very important thing to pay attention to. So know whether you should be thinking in pixels or inches. Know how many dots per square inch is appropriate for your project, and also be aware of the color space that is appropriate for your project, whether it's RGB or CMYK. And notice here, because we've clicked web, it's not even giving me the option to revert to CMYK, okay? So in this circumstance, I'm going to go back to print. I'm going to keep it 300 PPI, 8.5 by 11 inches. I want mine to be portrait, so I'm going to hit that button. And let's go back to CMYK, all right? White background. And we don't need to worry about the color profile business right now, okay? The other thing to keep in mind is there are other templates. So kind of dependent on the type of project that you're working on, Adobe has templates that can sort of help you on your way, okay? So I think I'm ready to go ahead and hit the big blue icon that says create. Okay, so now we've got basically, I mean, this is the Photoshop interface in all its glory. And the first thing I want to start with is, well, let me just kind of take a step back. And it's really easy when you start using this software to essentially just want to start playing a lot and experimenting a lot. And I think that's fine and dandy, and you can learn a lot by doing that, of course. But it's also okay to just hit pause and sort of learn what the heck is going on with this software. And by the way, this is industry standard software. It's the same software and it's the same interface or view that professionals are going to see in a graphic design or digital media marketing office. Okay, so this is a really just fantastic pro tool to start your career with. Okay. At the top, there is something called the menu bar. Okay. So let's see. Let's just kind of tour through this a little bit. I'm going to click on Photoshop, and mine just happens to be the 2025 version. And I can look at the the About Photoshop, which tells me the version. Let's see. I can go to Settings. Settings is really kind of handy. You can sometimes kind of change, a few things about the workspace, or like. I think one that I usually go to quite often, if I'm not mistaken, if I click on guides, grid, and slices, let's see, I can go over. Yeah, so you can change um, the the grid layout, which is kind of handy sometimes here. And so I just wanted to point this out to you. But obviously, you want 1 inch to be, you don't want to change that. But sometimes you want to have different subdivisions here. So instead of having 4 subdivisions, which is 1/4 of an inch, maybe you want to have 8 subdivisions, which is 1/8 of an inch. So in other words, you'd get smaller little squares to kind of, gauge things by. So that's just a small example of all of these, sort of hyper details that you can find here. I'm not going to change anything right now, so I'm going to just cancel out. But if you want to customize things a little bit, you can do that here. Okay, so let's see. Services, hide Photoshop. We don't need to worry about that. And then quit Photoshop. The shortcut is Command Q. Okay, of course we don't want to quit right now. So file. Let's see what's going on here. We can create a new file. We can open a file. We can browse and bridge. We can open something that we opened up recently, which sometimes can be handy. So if you're looking for something and you feel like it disappeared or it's hiding, sometimes you can come into the opened recently section and find that file. Cross your fingers, right? You can close a tab, or you can close all. But there are some other things that are really important here too, like save. Okay. So save as, print, um, placing. Or here, this is a big one that I'm always using, export, okay? Because you want to export a Photoshop file into something like a JPEG or a PNG or a file type that is appropriate for the context as far as where it's going. So this is really, really important stuff here, okay? Edit, okay? We can check spelling and there's a lot of, interesting things here. Um, I think the big thing that's really important about edit is undo. And I just want to point that out very, very clearly. If you ever feel like you've done something in Photoshop and you want to undo it, just hit Command Z, which is undo. Okay. Image. When you're working with an image, you can change the mode. Like maybe you want it to be grayscale. You can also make adjustments. You can add brightness or change the contrast. You can adjust the levels and the curves. You can add hue or saturation regarding color. I mean, you can do a lot of really beautiful things here within the adjustments area. Okay, so image size. If you're wondering, well, what size image is my artboard? Well, you can open that up and it'll remind you. And remember, we made a document that's 300 PPI and it's 11 by 8.5 inches. Okay. Going back to image, canvas size can be really important because maybe the image is a certain size, but you want the canvas size to be a little bit larger, which would expand the border around the image. So that can be really handy. So you would do that because uh, it's asking us to do that in pixels right now, but you could move to inches as well. Okay, but I'm going to cancel out of that. So image, canvas size. This is a really important one because sometimes you photograph or scan an object and you bring it into Photoshop, but the orientation is not correct. And so this is where you can actually rotate the image 180 degrees, 90 degrees clockwise, or 90 degrees counterclockwise. Okay. Layers, we're going to talk about that here in a bit, but you can create a new layer, but the real truth is I would advise that you do that in the palette over here. And again, we'll get there here in a bit. Type, as far as typography and fonts, selecting, filters. This is a really fun one. And this is maybe, I would actually advise that maybe you bring in just like a test image into Photoshop and you play around with some of these options like blur, distort, noise, pixelate, and just kind of this is definitely a playground or a sandbox that you could benefit from, okay? View, okay, this is sort of important. Notice how we opened up Photoshop and it's not filling the screen completely. So if I hit Command 0, it will basically blow up the artboard so it fills the screen as much as possible. But I can also hit Command plus and zoom in, and I can hit Command minus and zoom out. That's pretty cool stuff. That's bread and butter Photoshop operations, okay? Let's not talk about plugins so much right now. And this is actually a very important area. It's called window, or this is basically, all of these, like Photoshop is made up of all of these different functions, like properties, adjustments, libraries, the layers palette, channels palette, paths palette. All of these things perform different operations in your creative process. And oftentimes you can find them kind of hanging out over here on the right-hand side or around. But you can always go to window and all of them are available here. And you can even kind of see which ones are currently sort of highlighted with these check boxes. So if you ever need something and you're wondering where the heck it went, maybe you can just make it reappear by going to window. Okay. Another really important thing is workspace. And so when I'm using any of my Adobe applications, I'm always I'm always in Essentials Classic, okay? And so if you come over here and you can actually pull some of these windows out and you can hit these little check boxes, okay? And you can make them go away, which can be a little bit scary because then you're wondering, well, how can I bring these things back? I'll show you how here in a second. You can really dismantle Photoshop, um, and all of this stuff can sort of like disappear. And this is getting a little bit scary, guys, because I don't know I mean, how can you work Photoshop if you can access these things? Well, if you ever need to get back to square one or hit reset, my advice would be to, in the top right-hand corner, look at there are these different workspace modes, and right now we're in Essentials, and you can go back down to Reset Essentials, okay? Similarly, under Window, you can go to Workspace, and you can say Reset Essentials. And so now we have all of that good stuff back, okay? So no harm done. I think that's really important. So the other thing I want to talk about is the option bar, and that's like this space at the top, right under the menu bar. And it's called the option bar because it's fluid and it changes dependent on the tool that you have selected. So right now, let's see, this is the move tool. If I select that, these options will sort of change a little bit, okay? And maybe I want to use the crop tool, and watch if I click on the crop tool, the options menu is going to change, okay? So really important stuff, just to kind of be aware that this options bar is fluid and it evolves as you're working with the software. The toolbar is on your far left, and you can pretty much access all of the goodies. I mean, these are the fun tools that this is why, you took the class with me so that you could discover some of these fun things. And so it takes a little while to go through all of these, and we'll be going through them a little bit more in future videos. But for the time being, I just want you to know that all of the tools can be accessed more or less over here on the left-hand side. And also you can click and hold down, and sometimes you can get additional options. And I think that's really important for you guys to know when you're learning a little bit about Photoshop, okay? Um, the artboard, okay, let's talk about that. And I'm going to hit Command 0. Again, I like shortcuts because it makes things go a little bit more quickly. And by the way, for example, the eyedropper tool has a shortcut. So if I just put my cursor over that tool, it's showing me that I is actually the shortcut. So I can just hit I on my keyboard and that tool will pop up. That pretty much happens for a lot of these things over here, like same with the crop tool. If I hit C for crop, it will change, okay? So using the keyboard shortcuts can be very, very handy in your workflow, all right? So let's talk about the artboard. Pretty much this is your sheet of paper. This is where all of your creative artwork is going to go, and it's all pixel based. So you can import a photograph, you can create graphics, you can do a lot of different things, but consider this your sheet of paper. And if I zoom out, sometimes if you're looking at your desk, I'm looking at my desk right now. I've got my phone, I've got, some pens, I've got some, scratch pieces of paper where I can do some sketching. Consider this almost in a sense kind of like your desk area, okay? And this is your sheet of paper, all right? And I just hit Command 0 to bring things closer to the screen again so that we can see. On the right-hand side, there are, some different windows, or I call them palettes. Oftentimes you'll hear me describe them but you can modify color, uh, go into the swatches, you can play with gradients, you can play with patterns, adjustments. You go into a library, like a Creative Cloud library, for example. But the real truth is, all Adobe applications it's so important to really understand how crucial layers are within these applications. And so your layers palette, I mean, by far, your layers palette is one of your most powerful tools or operations with not just Photoshop, but all Adobe applications. So right now there's a basic background layer, but if I come over here and click this little plus icon, I can create another layer on top of that layer, okay? So I've got a basic background layer, all right? But I can also select a different layer and then do some work on it, okay? So here I can, put some content on that layer, and then actually there's a little eyeball tool right here, and I can just simply turn things on and off. That's kind of cool. I'm going to create another layer, and I'm going to change my color briefly, just for fun. And I'm also going to change my brush size to 100 pixels and just make a mark that's a little bit larger. So I'm just kind of trying to show you guys how cool and beautiful these layers are in a real fast manner, okay? I can also rename layers. I'm going to call this one red. Double click in, I'm going to call this one black, okay? And I can also even make the background layer go away. And what you're seeing with this checkerboard pattern is actually, it's called alpha channel, which basically means it's transparent. So it's not a white sheet of paper, it's actually transparent. So if you export a particular file type, like a PNG, for example, or maybe you've made a real beautiful logo and you want to deliver it to your client for their website, you would give them a PNG because that has the capability of having a transparent background. I know like a lot of this is jargon right now, and I'm getting into the weeds with things a little bit, but I think this is just a real fun kind of introduction to the Photoshop interface. All right. So that's enough for now, and thank you guys.